continue. All right, so it's predicated upon the way we understand pain in our society. In terms of the specific parameters of feeling pain, this has to do both with the way we reach out to solve, so to speak, our medical problems, and this is connected to biostatistics, what percentages of people are more or less prone to ask for help or not. But then the other portion of it is the neurological structures associated to the way we feel about ourselves when we are in pain. So the question I have for you before we begin with this is, are you familiar with the research by Robert Sapolsky regarding the connection between mental health, pain, suffering, and spirituality? Let me stop sharing for a second. I will write the name of this scientist. Robert Sapolsky is his name. Very famous neuroendocrinologist at Stanford. Does any of you know his name? Feel free to Google his name. No problem. Then you might be reminded of some of the lectures that might have appeared on the on YouTube or on the internet in general. Does any of you know his name? Please let me know with a yes or no, at least. No, all right, good. Okay. So fascinating. You're on for something very, very interesting. So before I continue, let me share one of my favorite lectures. There's a whole series of lectures that are freely available at Stanford University through their YouTube account or their YouTube channel and playlist. But this one specifically is the one that really intrigued me. So I will be sharing it right here, right now on the chat. This is a lecture that it was the only lecture that was not included in the standard playlist by Stanford, okay? And most of the time, if you just Google his name is related to biological underpinnings of pretty much everything: emotions, cognition, morality. So that's what he does for a living, and most of his lectures are available through Stanford online, on YouTube, etc., etc. With this exception, this lecture was not available right away, and it's something that could be quite controversial. I will not spoil the lecture for you, but the reason why I bring this to your attention is as follows. Now, one of the claims that Robert Sapolsky appears to make, and he clarifies toward the end of the lecture, that's not what he meant, is that any spiritual or religious experience is due to brain function. And at this point, it will not be too surprising. There's a lot of neuroscientists that claim that everything about our reality, spiritual including, free will including, it's nothing but neurological activity. But he makes this reference to the way we conceptualize pain from the perspective of our temporal lobe, specifically within temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, some of you might have heard of this research before. The general idea is this: individuals suffering with temporal lobe epilepsy are more prone to have this spiritual dimension in their awareness, which can translate into visions, into very profound interest in mysticism and religion and esoteric philosophy and so on and so forth. And the idea is that because of this temporal lobe epilepsy, the areas of the brain that are involved also have to do with the memory production and retrieval, so with your hippocampus. So the claim that Sapolsky makes is that it might be possible that due to this temporary impairment of both the hippocampus and the temporal lobe, while you are storing memories, then you might be more prone to magical thinking. So you might be able to link things that otherwise you would not be prone to link. For instance, things such as feeling that, I don't know, you spill some coffee on the table had some deeper meaning, okay? That everything happens for a reason, literally speaking. The fact that you had, I don't know, you scratched your car on the way to work had in itself a deeper meaning, and you might have attracted this negativity onto yourself. Now, aside from the theological considerations, some of which I agree with, some of which I feel are somewhat superficial in this analysis, or at least they are superficial in the way people think Sapolsky is discussing them. He clarifies that toward the end of the lecture, it's not the case. But the interesting thing is that one of the research that he mentions is connected to some religious experience of very famous individual, mystics and monks and nuns and imams and rabbis and priests and pastors and so on and so forth. And there is this novel he makes a reference to. Again, that's all I want to share because I don't want to spoil the lecture. It's a fascinating lecture. It has to do with this nun that has to choose between being, quote unquote, healed from her seizures or pseudo seizures, and by virtue of being healed, she has to give up this transcendental vision, this ability she has to communicate with God, or the opposite. She can retain all the suffering, the biological, neurological suffering, in exchange for this direct access to the divine. And so when we think about the conceptual model of pain, we could say this: there is meaning in suffering. This is something that most religion, most spirituality will claim to be true. The fact that there are things about reality that you cannot know but through pain. But now we also have a neurological, biological factor to justify that statement. And I find this extremely fascinating. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. If you're interested, feel free to click on the link. If you're reviewing this lecture, and of course the link will not be clickable, you can just type on YouTube Robert Sapolsky, and you can just write either biology and religion or something along those lines, and you should be able to access the same lecture. All right, so this meaning making associated with the perception of pain and suffering. So let's go back to the slide here. Okay. And let's make this comparison. I will skip this whole mathematical theory behind Engel's conceptual model of illness. But as you can see here, at the center, you have a physical problem. Okay. And again, it's not pain per se, it's the problem itself, an infection, a trauma, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have these three layers: distress, illness, behavior, and sick role, that are constructed in a way that it makes the person suffering from this physical problem being progressively swallowed by this physical problem. You are enacting a sick role. Your whole identity becomes part of your physical problem. In fact, you could say that this model is, for the good or bad reason, the model that we still utilize in the West, in the Western biomedical model, where most of medicine is focused on fixing the issue rather than going to the root of the problem, at least theoretically speaking. It's called allopathic medicine because of that very reason. You're going against the problem. Now, in Loeser's conceptual model of pain, things are slightly different. First of all, you don't have a problem per se, so it's not something that you need to fix externally. This still remains part of the surgical model or the medical model. But you already start from nociception. So you're already moving from there is something physical I need to fix to I need to understand what this perception of pain means for me, nociception, okay? At this level, it's not philosophical, of course, because nociceptive factors are biologically based. Now, the three layers here are pain, suffering, and pain behavior, which again promotes this new idea of the fact that the pain doesn't have to swallow us alive, but we are in dialogue with our pain. And so we can give a rationale, we can give a new narrative, which is exactly what traditional medicines usually defines pain as. It's a path. It's a knowledge that you achieve through self-discovery, okay? And this self-discovery, of course, is predicated upon physical suffering. So this is the thing I want to mention in this regard. I will skip a few more slides, and I would like to address this one here. I added this simply because I wanted to start from something that could be a good intersection between traditional medicine and our Western biomedical model. This is a very simple graph, and I picked this one for that specific reason. It identifies remission in major depression, and the comparative analysis here is pharmacotherapy versus psychotherapy. Now, you can see that 46.4% of patients are in remission with medications, okay? 46.3%, so extremely close to it with psychotherapy, and 24.4% with placebo alone. So this means two things. It means that medications are, by definition, biology. They're focused on the biomedical model. They might be overall still good, to some extent better, although 0.4, 0.3, it's not statistically significant in this context. And this is just one simple study by Smith of 2012. You can find plenty of studies that say the same thing. But it is this. Why is talk therapy so important in connection to medication? Well, there is something connected to the therapeutic modality itself, so CBT and DBT, but there's also something of a transcendental nature in the rapport we establish with the patient. So you might say this, while it is true that naturopathic, natural medicine always claims to spend more time with patients in comparison to MDs or DOs, very often the Western biomedical model says that, well, this makes the person feel better in the moment, but has no bearing on the way the patient will feel, physically speaking, after therapy. You know, you just be kinder, you might be displaying better clinical skills, bedside manners, but it doesn't really have any bearings on the disease itself. And yet, starting with depression, which we know to be, you know, both biochemically based with physical symptomatologies and emotionally and cognitively based, this is a good example of the fact that interaction in a holistic sense is the best strategy. Also because even if you have a quote unquote just a physical problem, all physical problems are also connected to some cognitive and emotional states. So even if you can address just those states, the emotion and cognition, then because of the reduction of anxiety and triggering mechanism and discomfort, you will have best outcomes, even on the clinical side of physical pain alone. Wonderful. The last portion that I want to mention about this specific slideshow is this. This has to do with the Hippocratic Oath and the basics of biomedical ethics. I will not spend too much time on this, but I feel that we should at least mention it because it's essential to understand complementary medicine. This used to be medicine, period. Okay, I'm talking about, you know, the Middle Ages and classical antiquity. But progressively, there's this split between being a doctor, as in physician, and then being, you know, either a bioethicist or an expert in HIPAA, rules and regulation, et cetera, et cetera. So I really encourage all students to review this. For now, I would just read through it and just give a brief explanation, and then we will move on to week 6. So the first one has to do with respect for autonomy, okay? The fact that the patient is at the center of therapy. I want to mention a few things regarding this because of the place we find ourselves in, Vermont. Vermont is one of the states where you could claim with a high degree of precision that the patient is always at the center of any biomedical decision, which means that the patient is empowered the most, you know, in comparison to other states in the union, which is a good thing, but also a controversial thing. For instance, in the context of palliative care, end of life care, or psychiatric needs, where we are not able to make informed decision on our own because we have limited capacity for understanding, or we might be under anesthesia or comatose, you know, semi-comatose state, vegetative state, locked-in syndrome, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where things are a little more complicated, because in the absence of an advanced directive, if you cannot make a decision for, you know, your own safety and health, the automatically assigned go-to person who will make decision for you will be your doctor. Okay. In other states, the automatic go-to person will be a family member, maybe a sibling or a spouse or partner. But in Vermont, we don't make any of these claims to protect the person. But of course, someone eventually will have to make the judgment. And it is not necessarily a bad thing that your doctor will make this judgment, because the doctor, of course, will have the best medical interest at heart. But of course, the doctor might differ in terms of their opinion and system of belief from the system of belief of the patient. Beneficence and non-maleficence has to do with both making sure to use the best possible practice and also the first do no harm. So in the context of what we just said, medication versus psychotherapy, one of the issues we have in the medical practice is that you might be aware of the fact that there is a natural remedy with no side effects whatsoever that will do just as much of a job as the biochemical pharmacological intervention, but you might not be able to prescribe that because on paper, and by paper I mean peer-reviewed paper, the biochemical model will give you the same result in a faster way, okay? So faster time. And so you might not be able to pick the natural one because in terms of the first do no harm and patient best interest, this will override the natural part. Double effect is the combination of the two, so we can skip that. And the next slide, the last three: justice, respect for people, honesty, and truthfulness. Justice, it's somewhat easy to understand and yet has a lot of repercussions in the context of public health. You could say that justice has to do with accessibility and fairness. So the fact that the same vaccine, for instance, the same pilot pharmacological intervention should be available to all people. But unfortunately, this is not the case due to financial or copyright-based parameters. Respect for people has to do with personal choices that might not have a lot to do with medical biological reasons, but simply philosophical, religious exemption, euthanasia, abortion, etc., etc. Honesty and truthfulness should also be a standard, and yet until the mid-70s, late 70s, a lot of medical research has been done without proper analysis or disclosure to the subject of this research. So those are all the parameters that we want to make sure to use in medicine nowadays. Okay, so I will stop here for week 5, and then we'll move on to week 6. Any questions or comments at this point that any of you would like to share? All good? Great. Okay, so let me switch gears and move on to week 6, which is this week. So we are right on time. And let's begin. Wonderful. So this slideshow is mostly focused on complementary natural medicine alone, in comparison to the previous one that makes this comparison between the biopsychosocial model, Western medicine, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take a look at this first introductory quote. It's a quote by Christopher, Bent, Mareczek, and Goodman. Science, whether in the form of methodological controls or evidence-based practice guidelines, cannot produce pure form of knowledge unaffected by the knower's place in historical time and geographic space. So before we continue, let me ask you a question. If you were to define science, and thinking, keep in mind medical science specifically, do you think that science produces knowledge, adds knowledge, discusses things that can be improved upon? What is science from that perspective? If you have, to give me a little definition here, I would like to hear your voice. You can also type. What is science for you? What does it do? What's the purpose? What's the main focus? Hello out there in the ether. Anybody? Thank you. A little bit about three things you mentioned. Thank you. Thank you, Mia.
Can I talk?
Of course. Yes, please.
I was just typing it out, but science is not like, it's always changing. So it's not like a definitive thing. It's not like a search for the answer. It's a search for like
Yeah.
answers that will eventually change.
Okay. I like that. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Liz. So I would agree with that. So, science by definition, it creates, well, let me use the term creates knowledge by trial and errors. It's always changing. With a big exception, we could say one of the things that doesn't change or doesn't change as quickly, if ever, is the scientific method we utilize. Of course, we might know more or less, and the scientific method might be predicated upon the new technologies we have. But otherwise, I fully agree with you. Pursuing knowledge of how things work. Yes, I like that too. Thank you, Molly. That's perfect. I think we mentioned this in the past, where philosophy or poetry or even theology will work on why things work. They make certain claims that are predicated upon differences in belief, but science is knowledge of how things work. Yes, I would agree with that as well. What else? Do you think science can justify itself? All right. How, if I may? This is not I'm not trying to trick anybody. I'm just curious about your opinion. Okay, you can, but with the caveat being disproven at a later time. Okay. I think science justified by the ways in which scientists interpret it. Okay, yes, fair enough. You could say, well, as long as we agree on the rules, okay, and by rules I mean the scientific method, then we can play the game accordingly. So in this sense, I would agree. One thing I want to mention here is, how about the connection between the how and the why? For instance, you might say, well, you don't need anything else to do science but science, right? So in this sense, science justifies itself, okay? I don't think it just exists. I think people have to make sense of it first. All right. Now, I promise I'm not asking this question to go, fully postmodernist on you or to criticize everything about science. That is something that really makes me angry at times. Certain branches of academia are there to question everything just for the sake of questioning. And there are things where I dare to put my foot down. In other words, well, you can judge misinterpretation of science, where science has been used, more than science, pseudoscience has been used to justify, I don't know, racist claims, for instance, and for which we should put the foot down and do our job to promote diversity and inclusion and so on and so forth, and human rights. But then once you start to question, I don't know, biology, plant biology, for instance, because of your idea of biology as, I don't know, a arrogant field. Now that's where I have a problem with. Okay. Now, the reason why I also asked, do you think science can justify itself is, for instance, assume that you're studying science in order to help people, medical science. Okay, you study all your biology and all your physics and neuroanatomy, pathophysiology in order to help people. That's your primary goal. Can you say this science progresses? There's a progress in scientific knowledge? Of course you can. We definitely can say that we know more nowadays than we knew 50 years ago, right? But the very fact that we add the term progress, so we can say that what's next is better than what came before, it's because there's something outside of science that tells us that our priorities are based, like in this case, in the amelioration of human beings. And I mentioned this because I mentioned Sapolsky, whom I really like. But of course, one of the issue with evolutionary biology, it's not a scientific issue. It's hard to, unless you're really on the fringe of science, it's hard to claim that evolution is not the best, the currently, best way to describe human animal evolution in that sense. The Darwinian evolution is the best explanation for the way biology works at this point. And yet to add the progress piece means that you have an external judgment. Could you call this a moral judgment, an ethical judgment? Perhaps, although that is a slippery slope to me, because I always disagree with claims that, well, you cannot be moral or ethical if you only focus on biology. You have to focus on spirituality and religion. Yes, I'm not sure if I fully agree with that. But the premises, the parameters according to which we judge something as better or worse has to be by definition outside of science. So this is what I'd like to share so far. Feel free to add your comments, but that is in connection to, again, this slide here about pure forms of knowledge. Okay. Now let's take a look at science in general, and let's take a look at CAM. So as usual, I like to begin with negative aspects. I do my best to be the devil's advocate, and then we'll move on to the positive ones. Again, this is somewhat of a caricature. By caricature, I mean I use the general overview on CAM, but some of the statements here are somewhat outdated. Okay, I will explain. First, limited scientific research. In response to increased consumer demand, funding for research studying alternative medicine is growing. But compared with traditional medical methods, so Western biomedical methods, evidence is still limited, which has left many questions unanswered. Currently, there are several studies underway. In order to learn about ongoing studies on alternative medicine, NCCIH recommends asking your primary care physician or other healthcare provider, visiting the research link on the NCCIH site, or going to your local library and inquire about scientific journals or online resources. The reason I mention it nowadays is because it's to say that evidence is still limited. I still want to put it there in this slide. This is from the previous semester, but it's growing to a point that we should think of there is limited scientific research only in certain very narrow subfields with the CM, but otherwise CM at this point is studying just as much as the Western biomedical model. But this is one of the criticisms you might hear. Okay, there's just not enough research, but this is false. You need to know where to find the research, of course. Next one, potentially dangerous interaction. Even in cases when the product contains no artificial substances, supplements and herbs can still potentially interact with prescription and over-the-counter medication. And some of these natural products have side effects on their own. Very, very common, but not mentioned enough, in my opinion. We always confuse natural with naturopathic, for instance. And I mentioned before, the term natural, unfortunately, doesn't mean much in the context of over-the-counter supplements. And just because something is natural, well, two things. First of all, our medication, despite of the fact that they might be laboratory-based, are nevertheless utilizing natural substances to begin with. Okay. And then just because something is natural doesn't mean it's completely deprived of interaction. So just something to keep in mind. Third, confusing marketing. Now, this is a slippery slope and a very controversial thing, especially in the US, I feel. Long story short, there's much more of an advertising industry in the US about big pharma in general than really anywhere else in the world. In many countries in the world, any ad, any commercial about medication is banned. It's completely illegal in the European Union, for instance. No pharmaceutical industry can advertise anywhere, whether it's in print, on TV, on the internet. But that doesn't mean that naturopathic or natural medicines are more honest, so to speak. They have just different ways to advertise, okay? And of course, the confusing marketing has to do with the fact that we might be more prone to fall for something that claims to be natural or safe, but the term itself does not have any specific requirement in terms of FDA approval or even, you know, the type of ingredient that have to be marketed. I would say that in Vermont, overall, we are in a better shape where by law, the label has to be as clear as possible. I would say it's never 100% clear, but the label of any type of natural supplements, including food supplements, by law have to indicate whether the product contains, I don't know, oxazolam, aspartame, high fructose corn syrup, GMO, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a good thing, but of course, it remains somewhat controversial. I included this slide here. This is a little old now because of, you know, due to COVID, this was not offered in the last 2 years, but I really encourage you, hopefully, God willing, COVID will be, you know, no longer, you know, here next year. I don't know. I really encourage you to take a look on the Restorative Medicine Conference that next year should be offered in collaboration for the first time with the American Academy of Integrative Medicine, and it's one of the central national conference platform where the focus is on prevention. And it's another thing that separates CAM from EBM. The fact that the Western biomedical model focuses on putting a patch on the issue, so to speak, okay? Fixing the issue versus complementary medicine focuses on what comes even before the development of a medical problem. All right, some positive aspects now, aside from the prevention, personal attention. Depending which research you focus, there's an average of 50 to 75% more time spent with each patient by naturopathic practitioner, naturopathic doctors, herbalists, etc., in comparison to standard MD. And the fact that the attention is given in the moment means two things. The one we already mentioned regarding to week 5, that the overall amelioration of emotion and cognition makes a person feel physically better on one side. The other thing is that it will also give the physician and practitioner more time to verify the presence or absence of certain symptomatologies. So the more time you spend, the better clinical picture you will have, and therefore you will also have an added reduction of possible medical errors. More things to be said here. Whole person treatments. This is also essential. You could say that complementary alternative medicine by definition is holistic, so views the person as an organism in the etymological sense of the term, where the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And I just gonna mention here, a key difference between traditional and alternative medicine is that most formal alternative medicine emphasize whole body care. Now, traditional in this context means EBM. Practitioners of alternative medicine address not just the physical body, but also the patient's emotional and spiritual health. I mentioned this before. I do understand the controversy because we want to make sure that when we practice medicine, we focus on medicine alone. And yet it is impossible to completely separate this aspect of transcendental knowledge in the context of CAM. According to the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine, a growing interest in a more holistic approach to health is one of the main reasons alternative medicine is on the rise. Now, I do also understand that just because something is embraced by the majority, it does not make it true. It could also be possible that people might just be frustrated with the current status quo, and that's why they might look for natural practitioners. So in this regard, I just want to ask all of you, let me stop sharing for a second. Did you have the chance to take a look at some of the videos on the previous model, on module 5 in this specific regard? And if you did, as I hope you did, since we didn't see each other, what's your take on that? Let me open that module again. There were 3 or 4 videos. One was about the pain. Okay, here we go. So there were 4 videos. So the neuroscience of pain, breathing into life, a journey into naturopathic medicine, and then the most important one for this perspective is the one by Marie-Britt Hermes. I will copy and paste the video here. Let me paste it here. I will not take it against you if you did not have a chance to watch the video, although I was hoping, since we didn't have the lecture. Now, let's just be honest. Please let me know if you watched this one or not, so that if you did, I will just ask the question. If not, I'll spend like 5 minutes explaining what the video is about. Okay, thank you for your honesty. Okay. All right, so I just take one no as an answer. Thank you, Mia, for your honesty. So Marie-Britt, thank you, Katia. All right, good. Honestly, you know, truth will set you free, as I say. So I include this video in week 5, again, to clarify some aspects. Now, Marie-Britt Hermes is at this point possibly the most famous naturopath in the United States that doesn't believe in naturopathy anymore. Okay, there are plenty of doctors that either are licensed naturopaths or they might be MDs with an interest or specialization or research in holistic medicine. I mean, the famous names that you can see on TV, right? You think of Dr. Oz, for instance, or Andrew Weil, for instance, or Stephen Gundry. Those names, you know, they might be associated either with this or that type of diet, or this or that type of detox, this or that type of holistic philosophical mindset. Think about what's his name, Deepak Chopra. Okay, so those are all either NDs or MDs, and if there is a criticism, is usually from the angle about the fact that Western biomedicine does not contain a holistically enough attention to patients, and the criticism for EBM is that they might be, I'm gonna be a little more extreme here, making false claims. Okay, so this is the general thing, but it's very, very unlikely that a person who embraces naturopathic medicine and changes their mind. In week 3, I believe, I have included another video about Edzard Ernst, right? And you should remember his name. So if you remember his name, he was one of the most famous European proponents of homeopathy, had all the training in homeopathy, was hired in a prestigious university in the UK to teach alternative medicine, changed his mind, got a big clash, media press with Prince Charles of England. And now he focuses mostly on criticizing anything natural, anything complementary and alternative. But he is MD. He started with a biomedical model. Marie-Britt Hermes instead went to a naturopathic medical school. She practiced as a naturopathic physician in the United States for many, many years. And then she had what she calls an awakening. If you're interested in hearing her perspective, of course, watch the video. You can also go on her website, which is Naturopathic Diaries, I believe, .com. I don't actually remember if it's naturopathic.com or .org, but if you just type her name, Naturopathic Diaries, the website should appear. And she changed her mind, not only thinking that naturopathic medicine or anything complementary to medicine, it's not really helpful, but she really thinks it's dangerous as well as immoral and therefore should be illegal. I mention this because it's one of the classic ad hominem or straw man arguments. Okay, let me just type here, ad hominem or ad personam or straw man argument. Now, those are arguments that have to do with the halo effect. For instance, let's assume, actually, no, let's assume, let me tell you her story. So she had a long history as an adolescent of multiple dermatitis, rosacea, I believe she also has psoriasis, And she went to multiple standardly trained doctors, MDs, and not only nobody was actually able to help her, but in her own judgment, they were very arrogant, diminishing, judgmental, paternalizing. And so she judged the whole thing from this perspective of, in a social critical theory, you could say the standard white male arrogant hierarchy. Okay, so she went on the opposite side, thinking, well, if these people are the one that claim to be intelligent, smart enough to treat me, and they're nothing but arrogant because they're not able to help me, well, of course I will look for something else. And so she started first studying naturopathy to help herself, and then she enrolled and became a naturopathic physician. She practiced for many, many years. Now, I don't want to spoil the story for you, but one day she was working in a lab, and her supervisor ordered a naturopathic medication, or rather a naturopathic ingredient to create a medication from the Ukraine. And this package arrived, but then there was something of an issue with FDA rules and regulation. And apparently her supervisor said, well, don't you worry, just stop this medication at the border because the FDA is always, a pain in the neck. And so she was a little triggered by it because she felt, well, if it's natural, the biggest criticism might be, okay, well, it's natural, but not be, dangerous. But if it stopped, at the border, maybe there's something else to it. And she always interpreted that for the first time as maybe, it's a question of miscommunication, or maybe international, differences between I don't know, postal services or requirements between countries. But then she started investigating a little more, and she became more and more disillusioned with naturopathy as a field. At the same time, she also fell in love with a biological researchers in Germany, left the United States, moved to Germany, got married, and now she is a student in a PhD in, I think, molecular biology. And aside from studying, her main job is going around the world and lecturing against her former profession. Now, as you can imagine, this is something that requires a lot of courage, because not only she gave up everything financially that she was able to achieve over the years, she was a successful naturopathic physician, and naturopathic physicians make money the same way as any other physicians, despite the fact that naturopathic physicians are in general not allowed to perform macro surgeries the way as neurosurgeon or cardiothoracic surgeon do, but they're still primary care providers. So not only she had to give up her practice and her standard financial income, but everything that up to the point defined herself as a person. So it was very brave for her to do that. My take on this, and again, you don't have to take my word for it. Please take a look at this video and look at her website. My take on this is a classical case of reverse ad hominem strawman argument. So because of the reasons she first embraced naturopathy were not scientifically solid enough, in my mind, she chose naturopathy because she was mad at the way she was treated by doctors, not because of the therapy itself. The opposite happened when she reverted away from naturopathy because of the way she interpreted the lack of moral insight from her supervisor. Now, I would say that overall there is a good news, the fact that you should never stop yourself whenever you have a inkling or a hint that something is fishy. You should study more, whatever you're studying. Now, if you're not familiar with ad hominem or strawman argument and halo effect, this simply means that you are judging something, you're judging a statement, not because of the validity of the statement itself, but simply because of the way you feel about the person making that statement. Okay, for instance, a person might come to you and claims that, I don't know, physicists are intelligent, but I don't know, engineers are not, something like that. And you yourself are an engineer, and emotionally you feel attacked by the person, and therefore you might be more prone to disregard this argument. If you're a physicist, you might have the opposite perception. You feel good about the statement, but again, simply because you are a physicist, and so you don't feel labeled in a negative sense. This is just an example. All right, so so this has to do with this claim of this holistic attitude, okay, and the fact that more and more people are going toward complementary medicine. I also want to say something else, and then we go back to the slideshow. Of course, I am a proponent of complementary alternative medicine. My background came from the Western biomedical model, and I still believe that the Western biomedical model falls short in many, many cases. Now, the reason why I mention this is because you could make this claim: if you practice natural complementary medicine well enough and long enough, then by definition, there will be no need for any naturopathic physicians to exist anymore, for a simple reason that all this type of medicine will be indeed incorporated into the standard medical model. So at that point, I dare to say, it would be rational to say that, well, if it works, it's healthy, and it's not dangerous, should be just called medicine, not alternative complementary medicine. The point is that we are not there at all, okay? So going back to our slideshow here. Okay, so whole person treatment. Next slide, and I will share a few names of people now. CEM and the body as a machine. I will not read the whole slide, but I want you to keep in mind this framework in cognitive science and philosophy: embodied cognition. So this is a new way to formulate the world, where the body has its own intelligence, it has its own language, and the only way to understand how the body exists and therefore how bodily processes occur is by relating to the body as an organism. So you can call it holistic science from the perspective of complementary medicine, or embodied cognition from the perspective of cognitive science, but you're actually meaning the same thing. There is no separation between mind and body in this context, okay? You have to understand this from that perspective. Now, next slide is one of my favorite scientists ever. She passed away a few years ago. Her name is Candace Pert, PhD. And please, I really encourage you to watch any videos with her. Okay, I provided a link below this slide. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal for two things. So who is Candace Pert? Well, let me just read the slide. She's the American neuroscientist and pharmacologist who discovered the opiate receptor, the cell binding site for endorphins in the brain. Pretty remarkable. One of the most important discoveries in all the fields that are interesting to us: endocrinology, psychoneuroimmunology, pharmacology, of course, and neuroscience. And all this for a definitely, application in medicine. So she's an excellent, absolutely excellent scientist. But it's interesting, and again, I wish we had a chance to see each other in person, because I always, show a few minutes of this video in class. She always lectures presenting herself as this, I don't know how to define it, as a fairy, white witch, I don't know, holistic, divine goddess type of thing, with flamboyant, clothing and apparel and scarves, and the way she moves on the podium, it's really on the opposite end from this, I don't know, idea of this aplomb, serious scientist. She embodies holistic knowledge by definition. She's this kind of, has this kind of fairy-like presentation. And I love her so much because her research is extremely precise. It's one of the most, I don't know, I'm possibly biased toward Candace Pert, but there's absolutely no way to discredit her research. It's just unbelievable. And yet, from our Western bias, the way she presents herself very often appears to the Western biomedical model as, well, that's too holistic, too new agey, too spiritualist, too emotional, flamboyant, etc., etc. And in that sense, I do feel that there is a hierarchical, arrogant attitude in Western science. Now, she mentions poetry, she mentions feminist theory, she mentions mythology and spirituality and religion, all mixed with her very solid empirical neuroscientific and pharmacological research. So this is kind of the reverse of what I said earlier. Make sure that when you study complementary alternative medicine, if you're ever skeptical about any claims made, that you focus on the research, not on your emotional reaction to the way a person presents themselves. Now, I picked that video also because she talks about the influence that Deepak Chopra had on her life. And I mentioned before some of my own, skepticism about certain claims of Deepak Chopra. They, in my mind, appear too new age, too, spurious in terms of the scientific claim. And yet this does not affect her research. So please take a look at the video and many other videos linked to the same playlist. It's fascinating. Also, the way she talks, she at first seems to be quite disorganized, going from one end of the podium to the next one, and going on and off stage, doing kind of interpretive dance here and there. Really not something that you would expect from a neuroscientist or pharmacologist. And yet she's spot on regarding everything that connects mind and body from the neurological standpoint. All right, so this is Candace Purr for you, one of the figures of complementary alternative medicine, where complementary alternative medicine was not a thing yet in the United States. So we're starting from science. The next few people, and then we'll skip a few slides here, have to do with social or critical theory. Maurice Merleau-Ponty on one side and Ursula Le Guin. Disclaimer, I just mentioned that I am extremely critical of certain branches of postmodernism, social critical race theory, Frankfurt School, post-Marxist, materialist school of thoughts, because I feel that there was a need for those philosophical presupposition at the time, and we're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there was just too much hope for the future of science in progressivism, which has nothing to do with progressive politics, but it's the idea of the machines will solve every problem in the world. And in this sense, it was a very Eurocentric, you could even say white male-dominated approach to science, where the European powers, the Western powers, were supposed to go everywhere in the world and colonize the world to teach them about technology and science, because the rest of the world was not smart enough. Now, that had to be put on a halt. And so in that sense, postmodernism, as being something that came after modernism, was very critical about these Eurocentric, arrogant ideas. And to go back here to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, one of the things that he said, he talks about this anti-cognitivist cognitive science, where the assumption is that you think as modernist scientists, you think you know a lot, but you're not aware of your own lack of knowledge, okay? But I do believe that this justifies our reactionary modality against positivistic science, but we had to be careful not to toss the baby with the bathwater. In other words, please study anthropological and sociocultural aspects of medicine, but keep in mind at the end of the day, you still need to make sense of the research. Okay, you cannot disregard the research. Now, so this is Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Ursula Le Guin, she comes from the perspective of poetry. She's a novelist, but also a feminist anthropology, so to speak. So she talks about sexuality and gender and ethnography. But the great thing about Ursula Le Guin is the fact that she talks about the way medicine in the West has been constructed to be artificially obscure in order to preserve its dominance over native people. So the medicine will use unnecessarily complex jargon simply to separate the people from this elitist group. And we had to demolish this hierarchy in order to make sure that science speaks for itself rather than through the hierarchical power. Okay, so I hope I make myself clear here. Now we talked about this positivist science, this Eurocentric attitude, but what about truly Aboriginal, native, traditional medicine? So let's skip a few slides and go here, Aboriginal medicine. So let me read from this. Actually, let me take a break here. Does it make sense to all of you? What I just share about what I hope I'll be able to convey in this lecture. So there are two extremes. One extreme would be the modernist, progressivist, reductionist extreme, this scientific claim where centuries or millennia of tradition don't count anymore. Only science done in a Western lab is what constitutes science. So forget everything has been done for centuries in Asia and in Africa and in Australia. Only what we claim to be true is true. And that's an issue, okay? Because you could say if it's science, it should be the same science everywhere. But the opposite issue is problematic as well, to reject everything that was accomplished as a result of this, somewhat obsessive belief in the power of progress, scientific progress. Does that make sense to you? Hello. Thank you. Great. All right. Good. All right. I really feel like if you're like in, I don't know, Olympic bobsledding, we kind of bumped on one side. Now we bump on the opposite side. Hopefully we'll find a path in between now. All right. Great. So Aboriginal medicine. Let me go back to that slide. So what do we mean by Aboriginal medicine? Well, first of all, we mean, where am I here? Autochthonous medicine. The term Aboriginal, if you remember, has to do with the origin. So you could use Aboriginal, autochthonous, native. From this perspective, they mean exactly the same thing, despite the fact that those terms are utilized in different ways if you mean in social sciences, okay? More specifically, in modern ethnomedicine, Aboriginal very often is connected to Aboriginal Australian ethnocultural aspects. And that's where we are beginning here. In Aboriginal Australian medicine, sorry, I forgot the term medicine here, the circle shape, okay, this magic circle, the wheel of health, we could say, the circle shape represents the interconnectivity of all aspects of one's being, including the connection with the natural world. Please make sure that you remember this. Including, which simply means that the natural world is but one world in traditional Aboriginal culture. There are many other worlds that are transcendental by nature. Medicine wheels are frequently believed to be the circle of awareness of the individual self. You can find them, in pictorial description, engraved in stones, etc., etc. The circle of knowledge that provides the power we each have over our own lives. How long ago some medicine wheels were first created, still up for discussion, but some have been dated, carbon date, of course, to 4000 BC, which is when the great Egyptian pyramids were built. There are suggestions that Bighorn medicine wheel, the largest and oldest, could be millions of years old. The original name for medicine wheels was sacred circles. The term medicine wheel was coined by non-native Americans, so no longer Australia, but this continent, in response to the Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming, the largest in North America, around the term the previous century. Now, so interesting enough, you have the connection between the same shapes and roughly the same attitude throughout the world, okay? And again, I don't want to make claims that are not scientific. When I think about the connectivity between ancient cultures, I cannot think of those memes about what's called, it's one of those pseudo-scientific shows on History Channel. Well, I guess History Channel is for the most part pseudoscientific. The one by Giorgio Tsoukalos or something like that. Either Ancient Aliens, something along those lines that, you know, they're kind of fun to watch, but they're not really scientific. But anyway, the fact that you can find the same attitude, you know, throughout the ancient world, you know, it's quite interesting. Now, those medicine wheels are actually utilized in modern times to connect this ancient tradition with modern understanding of medicine, public health, and even some element of social work, case management, addiction recovery. And this example that I included in the next slide, this one here. So as you can see here, it's this Aboriginal medicine is more after the original ones, and but it adds something again that goes beyond medicine alone. Keep in mind that medicine means healing in general. So, you know, we use this term in modern English, but we should really think of health as a whole. So some of the terms have to do with physical health and diagnostic improvement, but other things seem to be quite removed from medical or clinical practice and have to do more with community, even politics, society. So let's take a look here. First of all, you have these 4 elements because, again, Aboriginal medicine wheels have to do with the 4 seasons. So this is kind of the cycle of life. There are 4 seasons, 4 colors, 4 cardinal points, so north, south, east, and west, and then specific elements of practice. This one is actually utilized in North America but by multiple institutions that focus on the integration between native and traditional knowledge and current Western-based socio-political frameworks for public health. So I want to show you what I mean by that. So on the outside, you see the practice itself, what traditional medicine actually does: singing, drumming, elders teaching, etc., etc. Traditional teaching, feasts, ceremonies, sweats, etc., etc. And this is what's outside. As you can see here, it's a cycle. So there's end and beginning, it's a continuous cycle within seeking safety. So the idea is this is a secret garden. Okay, let me stop sharing for a second. Etymologically speaking, let me just tap it here. Garden, its connection to guardian. Okay, so what does it mean? I just want to mention a few things because this is essential to understand complementary medicine. The garden is this archetype, is this symbolic feature that describes what we have inside as a secret treasure. You see this in Victorian and post-Victorian literature, the idea of the secret garden, this kind of this almost Gothic idea of a old castle in Northern Europe and in England where you hide things. Okay? But it's also a secret garden in a mythological sense, even in a religious sense. Think of the Garden of Eve, for instance, right? The Garden of Eden in the biblical narrative. And again, you can mention, of course, monotheistic tradition, but very similar archetypes and symbols are found throughout the ancient world, even outside of monotheism. What's one essential idea of the secret garden is the idea of this clash between good and evil and the sacred serpent, the snake. Now, according to certain tradition, the snake is bad. According to certain tradition, is actually good. Some more modernist approach will see the snake rather than a temptation for evil as the primary go-to for good. So, in other words, the snake is a gnostic symbolism of deeper knowledge. I tend to disagree with this view just because it's historically inaccurate, although it might be quite catchy from the perspective of certain new age interpretation. But the idea is this: whatever you want to call it, the fact that you have an evil or negative influence, a negative influence that is predicated upon your inability to heal yourself from within, means two things. One, that pain and suffering, including medical pain and suffering, because the snake actually bites, something physical that occurs. If you don't analyze it within yourself, you're going to blame someone else. And this is, predicated upon the distinction between us versus them, which has to do with racism, with labeling, with injustice, and so on and so forth. And of course, racism by definition is antithetical with nativist Aboriginal medicine, okay? But it is this: not only you should not blame the other for your problems, but the problem is this: the evil you see is your own garden. So the garden is gardening and being aware of the attacks from the outside, but those attacks can only be interpreted once you remove the quote unquote bad weeds from your own garden. Now, we have to be careful here, because when we talk about medicine wheels and traditional native culture, we don't mean to say that everything is jolly good, so to speak. So that it would be a false assumption to think that socioculturally speaking, there were no tribal wars, for instance, in the context of either Australian Aboriginal culture or Native American culture. That's a false assumption. It might be actually something that we artificially put on retrospectively as a Western culture to idealize Native culture as lacking any warlike behavior, which is absolutely not true. In fact, the opposite is true, and we'll see what I mean by that. But the point is this: the fight against an opposite tribe, for instance, and protecting their own kin, medically speaking, it's not predicated upon racial or ethnocultural differences. It's simply predicated upon recognizing the fact that you need to protect yourself. It has nothing to do with racist bias in that sense, okay? Now, I want to mention this because it's important to find it in the ancient world. So, for instance, if you think about pre-medieval and medieval Europe, this was exactly the same thing. So in this sense, there's an overlap between cultures. So in Europe, you had this tripartite division in society, and I will spell it here. You had oratores. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I'm going to repeat it. Oratores, bellatores, and laboratores, right? So you had laboratores. You have these three main professions, not really a good term, but there were people that worked, the laboratores, the working class, so to speak. Although class is again a 1800 or 18th century, label, which doesn't apply to the Middle Ages. So people that work, people that fought, bellatores, so soldiers, you could say, and then people that prayed, so the spiritual guides. Same thing for Native and Aboriginal cultures. You had the elders that, as they age, were mostly focused on the spiritual domain, to the higher spirit. Okay, so they were oratores, they would pray, they were the primary channel with the divine being. Then you had warriors that were also higher up in society, and then everybody else that was not a consumer, was the opposite. They each took part in the divine creation, this poetic element. They were workers. Okay, so this is very similar in the ancient world. So let's go back to the slideshow. So think of this tripartite society. Now, at the center, you find community, teachers, and elders, exactly what we mentioned. And then you find specific definition in these four colors: purity and wisdom for old age, a new dawn, childhood, rebirth. Here you have growing to adulthood, direction, understanding, and then finally toward the end of one's life, later adulthood, the sunset, fading away, re-understanding. So this is very much consistent. All right, a few more things I want to mention here. So self, to remove this false claim that there are individualistic modern society as opposite to collectivist modern society. If we want to understand traditional medicine, we have to understand that the structure of culture was much more of a fractal, where each part resemble itself in the bigger realm. So the individual self was a kernel of the self of the community. Okay. This slide simply talks about the etymology of the self. Okay, so the fact that the self is integrated if it's not disintegrated, if it's not divided, internally split. Okay, as opposed to the personhood or personality, that is something that has to do with the way we present ourselves, with the appearance. Okay, from the Latin term persona, the Greek mask. Now, few more things I want to mention here. I will skip the next few slides, but maybe I want to go to, well, yeah, I think we can skip this one here, because this is just a mathematical representation of that. Maybe, yeah, let me go here. So, and we'll, let me try to do this. All right, so hold on to the conceptualization of self. Okay, so we talk about native and Aboriginal culture, where the self is a kernel of the whole, where all parts, those 4 seasons, are deeply intertwined. And we mentioned the fact that there were workers, praying people, wise people, elders, and there were fighters or warriors or soldiers. Okay, so there's 3 elements. Now, what is the connection between this type of social structure and what's on the opposite end, this transcendental element? Now, the last 2 slides actually have to do with this. And the last 2 slides are connected to the research by Stanislav Grof. I think I mentioned his name before. He is a physician, Western trained physician. He got his MD from the University of the Jagiellonian University in the Czech Republic, well, former Czechoslovakia at that time. Now he works in California, and he was involved during the late 60s and during the early 70s with a lot of holotropic, holistic research, including pharmacological research on LSD, mescaline, peyote, mushrooms, and a lot of Native American psychotropic, natural psychotropic interventions. Okay, and he coined this term of holotropic experiences. Okay, which are better defined as creating holistic, transcendental vision, so to speak. And one of the claims that he and his team made is there is a domain of empirical reality that Western medicine uses, that is the type of reality that we should use when we work on bodies, okay, when we interpret the body as a machine. But then traditional native medicine sees something between, sees something that can be absorbed through these holotropic experiences, and they can be brought back after this trance-like period into the current reality. So let me read it. Holotropic experiences can be triggered by various forms of systematic spiritual practice. Pay attention, systematic spiritual practice. Okay, so I don't want to give a false impression that spirituality and medicine in the context of native or Aboriginal culture, it's all about, I don't want to be disrespectful, but feeling the vibe and the present moment. No, it's actually a systematic spiritual practice. Something has to be studied, something has to be practiced in sequence with consistent supervision. Okay, it's not something that is just about experience. The experience itself will blossom as a result of that, but it's systematic the same way as medical schools is systematic. Okay, so the spiritual practice involving meditation, concentration, breathing, and movement exercises that are using different systems. And he makes a few comparisons here: yoga, vipassana, Zen Buddhism, Tibetan Vajrayana, Taoism, Christian mysticism, Sufism, or Kabbalah. Ancient cultures have brought on these states of mind through chanting, drumming, breathing, dancing, fasting, enduring extreme pain, and social and sensory isolation, and, of course, ingesting psychedelic plants. Such processes were important parts of shamanic practices, healing ceremonies, and rites of passage. I want to stop here for a second. Now, one of the most catastrophic examples within medical anthropology is the progressive loss of practice and tradition in Inuit culture in modern day Greenland. Now, this is really tragic. So for the longest part of modern time, Greenland was part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And on paper, it's still part of the Kingdom of Denmark, although very loosely at this point. I would say that the connection between Greenland and modern day Denmark is the same one as Canada with the United Kingdom. So it's still culturally associated, but progressively more loose, I would say. I mention this because if we think about medicine and culture, at this point, we would think of Denmark and Scandinavia in general as one of the most progressive, liberal cultures we have in the Western world, where there's an extreme separation between church and state. And also the levels of atheism and disbelief in anything spiritual is very, very high in comparison to, you know, even neighboring country, in comparison to Germany, for instance, in terms of Denmark. And yet a lot of people forget that Denmark is one of the very few countries in the West, definitely in Europe, but among the two countries in Europe, where there is still a state religion. Okay, so the Church of Denmark is the state religion by constitution. Why I'm bringing this to your attention? Not to go against religion or spirituality necessarily. In fact, I mentioned this multiple times, that those things are essential for a deeper understanding of complementary medicine. But there was a time, not a long time ago, really, we're talking about between 15 and 8 years ago, where Denmark, in an attempt to control the native culture, the Inuit culture in Greenland, required for all native population in Greenland to completely abandon anything that had to do with drumming or chanting as part of their medical wheels and shamanic practice. And the idea was actually done with a very enlightenment-like perspective. So the Church of Denmark is, of course, a Protestant church mixed with, of course, Scandinavian culture and French-based enlightenment. So the idea is that all these practices, all these traditional native practices were to be considered superstition. So it is fine to have religion as long as religion is only based on revision of text and theology, but anything that's liturgical or practice-like is by definition pseudoscientific nonsense. And this is kind of tragic because this is not the case of other culture. For instance, paradoxically, more Orthodox tradition have less of a blame. So you find less destruction of native culture in Russian Orthodoxy, for instance, you know, the connection with Uyghur culture, for instance, in Tatarstan, to give an example, or in certain branches of Orthodox Judaism or even Catholicism, but this attack to what it was perceived as superstition is part of the tragic outcome, where a lot of modern practitioners of traditional native medicine in Greenland are forgetting the ritual part, the drumming, the chanting. And again, this is a primary way to exist, to achieve that state of mind that neurologically actually will trigger the mechanism we just talked in connection to holotropic experiences. All right, let's finish strong. One more slide. All right. Also by Groth et al. Section research. And if you are interested, I can actually give you some recommendation for books published in this area. Alternate or alternative states of mind. In these states, consciousness is changed, but it's not grossly impaired. All intellectual functions are intact and the person remains fully oriented. The content of holotropic experiences is often spiritual or mystical. This state involves sequences of psychological death and rebirth in a broad spectrum of transpersonal phenomena, including feeling of oneness with other people, nature, and the universe, past life experiences, and vision of archetypal beings and mythological landscape as described by C.G. Jung. This has to do with what Grof coined as psycho-spiritual crisis. So he is a physician, but he claims that this is one of the most important etiological elements, so the origin of modern medical problems. The fact that we are separated from the source. Now, I do understand that this is quite a big claim, and yet this goes back to what we said in week 1. If you remember, we mentioned the concept of vita, okay, which is Latin or Italian for life, connected to biological life. So vis, bios, in archaic Latin or Greek, and vitalism as in mesmerism. If you remember, we talked about Franz Anton Mesmer, and we will mention his name again, which is really the same thing as Qi in the traditional Chinese or Tibetan medicine. The spiritual entity that is considered to be the ultimate truth, but native Aboriginal tradition, it's not to be interpreted as it's a truth against the truth you can observe with biochemistry, molecular biology, and so on and so forth. But it's the ultimate truth. It's a truth that never changes. And that's exactly what I asked you the question about an hour ago about what science actually is. Is science something that can justify itself? Now, science, the way we practice it nowadays, should be constantly challenged because it is the best form of investigation. It has to progress by trial and error. And yet, there is an underlying mechanism that in all traditional medicine is considered the primary source. For instance, to give you an analogy, you could say this, that the ultimate truth is A, universal, B, eternal, C, never changing, the source, but the way the source manifests itself outwardly takes on different narratives and different structures. So anything that is older than 70-year-old in medical science is considered old, right? So you have to, if you use bibliographical references, the general recommendation is make sure that the research is current. And current means less than 7 years. And yet, if you want to focus on what will carry you through, you want to make sure to consider the primary source, which is never changing. So this is also something that I want people to bring home. If you study traditional medicine, you have to have these two opposite magnets, poles, one which will spare no enemies. If you are in the lab and you want to verify whether a certain remedies works or not, then the most recent research is the only thing you need to care about, okay? In other words, there's a research that disproves a previous claim, well, you just need to abandon the claim, period. That's how science progresses. At the same time, you need to look at the bigger picture. And you want to invest in those things that never change. And those things that never change, of course, have to do in native and Aboriginal culture with the spirit, okay, with the primordial life, vitalistic experience. So this is what I wanted to share this week. Any suggestions or comments or questions at this point? Good. Maybe something I want to leave you with is this. This is more about reflection for all of you. You don't have to answer, just try to think about it for the next few days, and maybe we can talk about next week. So why would someone study natural medicine? I will let's assume that you study natural medicine the same way as you observe memes on the internet, okay? Of course, you don't really achieve any deep scientific knowledge by looking at the at the internet in general, dare to say, but memes are caricatures of knowledge, but you probably are familiar with certain, caricaturesque criticism, where if you, I don't know, if you see those memes, STEM fields versus liberal arts, right? Or real science versus soft science, or biomedical sciences versus social science. It is type of memes where one is considered real knowledge and the other one is considered like, pseudo emotional interpretation. And here's the idea, something that I mentioned in few classes of mine, and for the one of you that are in this course and also in the one on critical neuroscience, you might be familiar with this already. The idea is this: can we claim that if we study medicine, we are nothing but biology, chemistry, and electromagnetic field? Can we make that claim? Well, emotionally, to some people, this might be controversial, because you might feel, well, I certainly would like to be more than just, biology and cells, but it's also very nurturing, because again, it's less up for interpretation. You could say, well, it doesn't matter where you study medicine, as long as you know your stuff, you're going to be able to help me. And in my mind, this is the best way to look at science. So in this sense, we should pay more attention to, I dare to say, biology, chemistry, than poetry, arts, and music. Okay, for a simple reason that I don't mean to judgmental, but arts and music do not heal, biologically speaking, as far as we know, the same way as the biomedical model does. Despite the fact that this is actually a false claim, because that there is evidence of the therapeutic, effect of music, for instance, or art. But if you have a surgery, it doesn't matter what music you play, the surgery will be the thing that will save you. And yet, what we said earlier about this postmodernist claim where everything is up for interpretation, including biological science, is no longer valid, it's also false for this reason. You need to focus on external factors to understand things that you don't get yet, and that's why you need to rely on the shoulders of giants, so to speak, meta-analysis and previously published peer-reviewed research. But then at the same time, you need to work on yourself, so that once you base your interpretation of reality on your thoughts and emotion, those thoughts and emotion are as much as you can connected to this higher self, exactly the same way as Native American tradition or Aboriginal tradition understand the self. It's like having a direct connection to a faucet, so to speak. You want to make sure that your water is flowing, and that's how you interpret the world. So just think about those things in the next few days. All right, so thank you again. I wish you a good week, and we will continue on week 7. So we are reaching slowly the midterms, which is great. Having this big bump, and again, the midterm, we will not have an official midterm exam. We will have a quiz, of course, which is constructed in the same way as any other quiz. So do not be afraid. But as we move into an essential part of this semester, my advice will be start to think about what captures your attention, what kind of interest you have, because I must say that I'm struggling a little bit in trying to make this course interactive, because I don't see a lot of you, and I do respect your privacy, but not seeing faces, it's hard for me to know whether you're enjoying it, whether you're paying attention or not. So the draft for the final paper, this 1-page description of your interest, or at least what you would like to focus on for the final paper, will be something that will give me the chance to get to know you better, and also to give you some feedback if needed. All right. So thank you. Until next week. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.